Friday, July the 28th, 1995, the eve of the centenary Bledisloe Cup match in Sydney. The stage was set not only for a great test match, but also for a showdown between the Murdoch and Packer camps that would change international rugby forever.
In this fight between Packer and Murdoch, they're doing high blows, low blows, headbutts, the whole thing. As I understand it, the $4 million that Kerry Packer had written out was a pressure point right there under the neck, where he was able to say, well, look, this $555 million deal you've got, I got your players, mate. How do you like them apples? And I don't think Mr Murdoch liked them too much.
During the week leading up to the Bledisloe Cup, the All Blacks were staying at the Manly Park Royal, and it was here that WRC's top man in Sydney came to do the deal. Jeff Levy knew that the All Blacks, as well as the Wallabies and the Springboks, were absolutely committed. The pressing question now was when, not if, the All Blacks were going to sign.
At the end of the day, they said to me that they will sign, but they don't want to go and upset all the boys. Everything was settled. They knew what they had to sign, and they'd release the contracts. I said, it's not good enough for me. I want it done before the dinner. They said, OK, the deal is straight after the game, they'll shower, put on their blazers for the dinner, but they'll get in a bus and redirect it to where I live, around Rose Bay, Vaucluse area of Sydney, and come there. We'll get all the lawyers in, we'll get it all signed, and so that they'll have, before they go to the dinner, absolute commitment to this.
July the 29th, 1995, Bledisloe Cup Day. It was perhaps the most stressful day in Jeff Levy's life. The dream of creating a new world order of rugby was within his grasp as he headed towards the game.
I remember walking to the Bledisloe Cup, which from my house is quite a long walk, because I am actually a traditional Jew who doesn't drive on the Sabbaths, which is for us a Saturday, so I actually walked to the game with one of my sons, and we arrived at the game, watched the game, I remember, and was always thinking about what's going to happen after.
Well, there's a great beginning by Robin Brook. The All Blacks played a blinder that day. They were back on a high after the disappointment of the World Cup final.
Lomu first touch of the ball. And it's Frank Bunce for the line.
But at full time, something happened which turned the rugby world on its head. Something that told every rugby supporter on both sides of the Tasman that the union-controlled game as they knew it was dead.
And whatever happens in the future, we hope that you and the union support us. Thank you very much.
Now, if you see those words black on white, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. But in the atmosphere of that stadium at that day, what that meant to everybody was, it's true, we're gone, we'll cop you. Like me, like a lot of other people, there was just this boiling emotion of, you bastards, you know, you've done this. Well, you're going to... And I remember walking through the car park, the Sydney Football Stadium next to it, and I was, you know, fingers itching, wanting, get me a typewriter, get me a torpedo, cop this, mate. And I remember saying something to the players. What are you guys thinking of? Rugby is your mother. For 20 years, she's wiped your nose clean, she's picked you up, she's held chook raffles to fly you around the world, given you more glory than you can possibly imagine, allowed you to walk up and down George Street taller than you could ever imagine you could be. Now, Mum has come into some money, and you're going to get your fair share. But if that's not enough for you, if you want Mum to whore for you too, well, you will be deserving of the fate you get, and the fate you get, and also, I was a bit overblown. When I look back upon it, you know, I was feeling a bit hot under the collar. But those were the times.
Normally, after a Bledisloe Cup match, the All Blacks would shower, change, and head off to the after-match function here at the ground. But that night in 1995, instead, they came down here, boarded a bus, and took off.
All Blacks spend hours on bus journeys, but the short trip from the Sydney Football Stadium to the upmarket inner-city suburb of Vaucluse must be the most remarkable. Here we had the entire squad of more than 20 players, the two coaches, Laurie Mains and Earl Curtin, and manager Colin Meads, being driven not to the home of Jeff Levy, but to the plush mansion of Brian Powers, Kerry Packer's top man in Australia. The last-minute change of address was to provide the final proof to the All Blacks that Packer was committed to making the WRC an absolute reality.
Colin, Earl and I, knowing what was going on, stayed in the bus. We did not want to be part of this. The irony of the thing was that the good doctor and the physio, not knowing anything about what was going on, bowled into the house with the boys and were entertained for an hour while they were in there in one of the other rooms and thought we were just there for a social occasion.
At the Powers house, the All Blacks would have finally signed contracts that looked set to kill off the All Black legend forever.
They left some of the coaching staff on the bus. They came into the house. They went downstairs into a large room which the Powers residents had, where they met with their lawyers. None of us went down. We had to stay upstairs until we were asked to come down, and we were told, here are all the contracts, they've been signed. There were one or two who hadn't yet signed because they needed one or two clauses sorted out. There was one guy whose agent wanted a lot more money, so he was prepared to sign only if we gave a lot more money, and we had to reconsider that. And he was an international star of high repute, so that was one of those sort of things. But other than that, everyone had signed.
We got quite agitated out in the bus as time went on, and finally I went into the house and said, come on guys, we've got responsibilities, let's go.
So having signed the rebel WRC contracts, the All Blacks reboarded the bus and headed back into town.
But that night at the dinner, it was a very testing time with both parties knowing what was going on.
The centenary dinner that night was to celebrate 100 years of trans-Tasman rugby. The atmosphere was electric because the former greats from both New Zealand and Australia had begun to realise that the game for which they had made such great sacrifices was about to be sold out.
And I remember myself with Bob Dwyer, and by this time I realised Bobby was in, Bobby was with them. And to that point I hadn't realised how much I'd sort of valued, I don't know, international rugby or whatever. And in my mind, and not truly, but in my mind, this was the death of international rugby. This was the death of everything that I held true, and it wasn't really, but at the time that was the feeling. And I remember having a screaming match with Bob Dwyer, basically in front of a whole lot of people, and it got so heated I thought if I don't turn on my heel and walk away, I'm going to belt him. And I turned on my heel and walked away, and then regretted that, not that I'd been so angry, but that I hadn't belted up. But sort of turned back, ah! But it was that, there were those sort of scenes going on all over the shop.
Fitzy and I were just sort of looking at each other, shaking our heads, just thinking, these guys just have got no idea what's going on. And they were very blinkered and didn't want to know what was going on.
So what had gone on? Well, make no mistake about it, the All Blacks were gone. International rugby had just been turned on its head. The 1995 All Blacks had signed contracts with the World Rugby Corporation, the WRC. For the promise of even greater riches, they turned their backs on the very real $555 million Murdoch deal. It meant they were no longer All Blacks. They'd left behind the New Zealand Rugby Union and just walked away from the All Black tradition and the silver fern.
All right, I may have a big nose.
When Jock Hobbs returned to New Zealand after the 1995 Bledisloe Cup, he was a man under enormous pressure. The weight of the Rupert Murdoch empire was being brought to bear by Murdoch's top man, Sam Chisholm.
He would sue, he would send a barrage of lawyers from his organisation. He would bog the New Zealand Rugby Football Union so deep that would take us a long period of time, if ever, to get our head out of the swamp. They were not happy. So going back to New Zealand after the weekend, there was a lot that needed to be done in a very short period of time, and there was this feeling that the World Rugby Corporation, and I believe, looking back on what I know now, it was their intention to launch that following week.
Jock Hobbs still had no idea that the WRC had beaten the New Zealand Rugby Union to the punch by actually signing up the players. During early August, he set about travelling the length and breadth of the country, talking not just to All Blacks, but to top provincial players who would make up the backbone of the New Zealand teams in Murdoch's upcoming Super 10 competition. At these presentations, the All Blacks, who'd already signed with WRC, never let on. They held their tongues while Jock Hobbs put the rugby union's case. Back in Wellington, it's hard now to imagine the pressure that Hobbs and the other lawyers on both sides of the rugby war were under. At one point during these difficult days, at least one of them actually feared for his life.
He was standing in the shower and he heard a very sharp, loud crack, and he dived to the bottom of the shower with the first thought that someone had fired a shot at him. Now, I know that that must sound absolutely incredible to people that were not involved or at a distance, and even it does seem that a little now, time having passed. But at the time, we are talking about two very powerful international businessmen, hundreds of millions of dollars, tiers of people that were earning or who could potentially earn through success fees enormous sums of money. There was a lot involved.
Just how much was involved became apparent back in Sydney when the three Southern Hemisphere rugby unions were summoned to crisis talks by the Murdoch organisation. The headquarters of the Australian Rugby Football Union. And it was at a meeting here that the man who originally brokered the Murdoch deal, Ian Frickberg, finally convinced the three Southern Hemisphere unions that they were in deep trouble.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the full realisation is starting to dawn on the rugby unions of what has happened. The players have gone, mate. And you've got this situation at North Sydney in the ARU offices at the boardroom table. Frickberg gathers in Richie Guy, Leo Williams, Ferrier, the leaders, Louis Lake, they're all there from the unions, and he's saying, listen, you don't understand what's happening here. You've got 120 players have signed in South Africa, 140 have signed in Australia, 150 have signed in New Zealand, and all the bosses are saying, no. Frickberg, you're not listening to me. I don't care if you've known them for 10 years. I don't care if they're looking in you in the eyes and telling you they love their mothers. I don't care if you rocked them on their knee just after they were baptised. They're fucking gone.
Those words echoed around Sydney. The meeting finally showed the rugby unions how far behind the play they were. It was a huge shock, especially to Louis Late.
But we didn't know at that time that the players were signed up. They kept it so secret, so close to the chest. We didn't know that. Otherwise, we would have, like I said, we were fighting against Rugby League, not the Turnbull group. And it was only later on, when we were in Sydney, where we discovered this is serious now. Our players had signed up. And that's why at Chisholm's home, he nearly blew a fuse there at his home. Jumped up and down like a jack in the box. You've got to do this, you've got to do that, and shouting and screaming, ranting and raving all over the place, and I said, be calm.
Back home in South Africa, it was a fearsome Louis Late who summoned the Springbok captain Francois Pienaar and other senior players of the Springbok team to come and see him immediately.
How much pressure were you on?
A lot of pressure, a lot. The most pressure I've ever been on in my whole life. In my whole life, I've never been put in such a position.
The problem was, of course, Pienaar and the Springboks, along with the All Blacks and the Wallabies, had now all signed Turnbull and Levy's WRC contracts.
And he had Louis Late on one side saying, you've got to do this, or, basically I'll wear your balls for earrings, was, as I understand, pretty strong language used. And on the other, you had the Turnbull people saying, matey, your contract here, you signed it, okay? We have the documentation that you are with us. Don't tell us you're not with us. And then it all came to a head on, I think it must have been early August 8th from memory, where they had this video hookup, which was Phil Kearns with his lads in Australia, Sean Fitzpatrick with his in New Zealand, and what was meant to be Francois and the Springboks.
Because of the importance of securing the World Cup winning Springboks, Ross Turnbull had remained in South Africa in the weeks since the Cup. With the rugby unions now fighting back, Turnbull organised a satellite link-up to once again reinforce the commitment to the WRC of the All Blacks, the Springboks and the Wallabies.
We're all going down to the studio to televise the meeting, and Francois was with us with Small, the winger, and I saw a discernible difference in Francois' demeanour. In fact, far from being this enormously powerful, impressive man that I just saw a guy that was scared, frightened. And of course I knew then that something had gotten to him. And I said to him, "You're going to come down in the car with me?" And he says, "No, I'll go with someone else." So I knew then that whatever forces there were out there had got to him. And I felt very sad for him. Very unfair.
And you understood later what those forces were?
Sure. Money.
Well, obviously he was under a great deal of pressure. But I think the feeling from the rest of us, both in Australia and New Zealand, was that he'd sold out. And no one was particularly happy with him, to say the least.
You come to Phil Kearns and says, "Right, boys, this is it. This is it. We're in the new age. We're taking it forward here." Sean Fitzpatrick, good, we're with you. It's happening. We think, right, over to you, South Africa. And then the vision comes onto the South Africans, and you can see sort of Kearns and Fitzpatrick going, "Where's Francois?" And Francois didn't front.
At that time, Francois Pienaar, as World Cup winning captain, was the most popular rugby figure in South Africa. So why did he cave in? What did Louis Late say or do to turn his head? Louis Late simply said, "What do you want?"
So what will it take for you to stay here? What does it take for you? And it didn't take much for them to decide. They asked me to give them a few minutes, which I did, half an hour. And they came out, and Francois Pienaar did all the talking. He said, "Yes, we'll stay."
So with the South Africans staying, the tide of the rugby war had swung irrevocably back towards the establishment. Louis Late had found the weak link in the Springboks. Jock Hobbs was to be credited with finding the chink in the All Blacks' armour, and he found it in the heart of the Otago provincial side.
From the outset, the 1995 All Blacks had agreed that it was all for one and one for all. They thought that signing on with the WRC was in the best interests of the game. But within a few short weeks, it dawned on one or two of them just what they'd given up.
The catalyst were the people down here, were the homegrown Otago people, the players that wanted to see All Black rugby and the All Black tradition continue. And they helped me make a very, very tough decision. And, you know, it's one that I'm glad that I made.
Yes, what finally convinced Jeff Wilson to break ranks with the rest of his World Cup teammates was the fact that under WRC, he would no longer be an All Black. The identical thought occurred to Josh Kronfeld.
I only had 6 test caps and I wanted a few more, you know.
On the 10th of August, Wilson and Kronfeld were heading out of Dunedin with the Otago provincial side. Before they got on the plane, they phoned Jock Hobbs to say that during a stopover in Wellington, they would sign with the New Zealand Rugby Football Union.
I do, however, have the pleasure in announcing that I am holding letters from lawyers acting for Jeff Wilson and Josh Kronfeld, confirming that these 2 All Blacks will sign contracts with the New Zealand Rugby Football Union.
Unlike the provincial players who would also sign with Hobbs, Wilson and Kronfeld had now signed with both the WRC and the New Zealand Rugby Football Union. This still rankles with the WRC liaison man, Andy Hayden.
The New Zealand Rugby Union induced them to break their contracts. And now, these days, feel terribly aggrieved if a player breaks a contract. I don't know why that would be the case, because if they were going around inducing players who had all signed to break those contracts, I think there's a legal implication there.
It was very significant the next day. The table turned. The next day I received a telephone call from the All Black camp that they wanted to meet with me.
It wasn't long before Sean Fitzpatrick, the All Black captain, who had thrown his considerable weight behind the rebel WRC, had also changed to sign up with the NZRFU.
I think with Jeff and Josh making their decision, I think that that forced some people's hands, and that's, you know, what Jeff and Josh did. That was their decision. That was the way they wanted, and that was great. But for us, as we said at the beginning, there was no way there could be two competitions. And with them doing that, there was obviously one over there and one over here, and we said the WRC guys then, we said, look, we don't think this is going to be the best thing for the game, and they said, okay, fine, that's the end of it.
The rugby war then was over. The Springboks had deserted the WRC, so too had the All Blacks, and then the Wallabies. The pack of people who'd been backing WRC seemingly just lost interest and turned off the money, cutting their losses rather than entering into a prolonged legal battle to hang on to the players. The Blazer Brigade had won. So when you look at it now, Richie, I mean, when you look at the players who are involved then, when you think about Josh Kronfeld and Jeff Wilson, do you think of them more fondly, in a funny sense, because of their leadership role and staying with the NZRFU?
No, not really. I mean, I think all the players probably fit into the same category. They're either all going to stay or all going to go. The reason they didn't go was because there was no money. I mean, that's plain as the nose on my face. And if the money had been there, they'd signed the contracts and they'd have gone.
Was it as simple as saying their money wasn't guaranteed, but the Murdoch money was?
Yeah, because that was, you know, that was maybe one thing they did wrong, was they didn't guarantee it. But that's, you know, it's all history, and I'm just pleased that it's all turned out the way it has.
So how has it turned out? Well, the century-long All Black tradition survived. Murdoch's Sanzar deal has produced the very successful Tri-Nations and Super 12 competitions. Rugby is the winner, as indeed are the players now earning hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the two All Blacks who were first to sell out the WRC dream, Kronfeld and Wilson, have gone on to enjoy spectacular success. But it hasn't been without its odd moments of tension from senior players.
I don't think there was any malice really held towards us. I know Richard Lowe gave me a whole lot of grief in a room with him the following at the end of the year, but it was all in, you know, I mean, he wasn't being vindictive as in terms of, he was just Lowe being Lowe, you know.
The aftermath for Jock Hobbs was more drastic. The rugby establishment, the men who ran the game he helped save, dumped him from the reformed New Zealand Rugby Football Union Council.
That exercise had been, you know, very demanding, and I had contemplated over the Christmas period not even standing, simply because, and I think inevitably, just my reservoir of rugby had just sort of drained. It was lower.
But to me, the most interesting postscript to the 1995 Rugby War involved the story I heard about Springbok captain Francois Pienaar, the first Southern Hemisphere player to sell out from the WRC rugby circus.
Francois Pienaar in real trouble.
We've heard a story that in '96 the All Blacks were so angry with Pienaar over his withdrawal from WRC. They were very angry with it.
Right.
Can you describe the events in the test at Cape Town that led to Pienaar being carried off?
The events that led to him being carried off? No.
In this match in 1996, Pienaar was to come off second best. He was injured badly enough to be carried off on a stretcher. For a variety of reasons, Francois Pienaar never played for South Africa again.
Because we've been told that the All Blacks set out to get Pienaar in that game.
No, not at all. We, it's true to say that the All Blacks were very disappointed in terms of what had gone on, in terms of his, the things he had said to us and the things that he was doing.
So there was no revenge factor?
Not at all. Never. I can swear on a Bible, Quinny.
Legends of the All Blacks with Keith Quinn was proudly presented by Ford and Air New Zealand.